Um, Good afternoon. My name is Erica Ebelhair, and I'm a 3L here at Penn State, and I'm a former member of the Manglona Lab for Gender and Economic Equity. I want to thank you all for being here tonight, for taking the time to listen to these women discuss their experiences and what they were able to learn through this process. I'll be moderating discussion this evening, and in a moment, I will ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves. But first, I just want to briefly discuss what the Manglona Lab does. So we're here today specifically to talk about interviewing witnesses to HerStory. Witnesses to HerStory are women who lived through pivotal moments in US history, and we are here to kind of explore their stories. So through this project, members of the lab assist in capturing their personal experiences of these women, focusing on their participation in education, sports, and in the workforce. Between 1963 and 1978, there were maybe, okay, maybe not. There we go. Between 1963 and 1978, we saw a lot of significant changes in the law that affected women in very foundational ways. So this is not an exhaustive list of every law that impacted women, but the timeline on the Manglona Lab website highlights a few. So some that are very pivotal, the Equal Pay Act, the Civil Rights Act, Title IX. I won't read all of them. I know you all can read, you're in law school. But understandably, there is a lot of different laws that happened during this period impacting women. So the women we have interviewed through the lab and continue to interview grew up, went to school, got married, entered the workforce as all these pivotal changes were happening in American history. Um, their experiences were fundamentally different than mine, fundamentally different than everyone on the panel up here, and fundamentally different than everyone in the crowds. These experiences illustrate the necessity of these laws and the importance of learning and teaching HerStory. These interviews also demonstrate the need to keep working towards gender equity, especially in light of laws that we're seeing come to fruition today, like the SAVE Act, which would disenfranchise millions of women and other unrepresented groups when it comes to voting in national, state, and local elections. So with that being said, we're going to go ahead and introduce our panelists. I'll introduce them from my right to my left. So first we have Maria Andrea Bernal Cruz, who is an LLM class of 2025, and she is a member of the lab right now in spring of 2025. Next, we have Charity Williams. She is a JD candidate class of 2026 and is also a member of the Manglona Lab right now, spring 2025. Next, we have Kiera Stubbs, a JD candidate, class of 26, a member of the lab for the fall of 2025. We have Bailey Keenan, a JD candidate, class of 2025, who was a member of the lab in fall of 2023. And finally, we have our fearless leader, Professor Scholes, who has been the director of the clinic since its founding in 2021. So I'll start with Maria. Would you mind just telling everybody who you have sought interviews with and why you chose those individuals?
Sure. I had 3 interviews. My first interview was with her name was Jackie Drummer. She was a native educator all her life. She taught special gifted education all the way from pre-K to grad school. I also interviewed a woman called Denise Sticha. She was a lifelong librarian. She's thinking about retiring this year, actually, and she has been working in libraries, all her life since she was in 4th grade. And finally, I interviewed Pat Gozemba. She's been a very avid and participant in the women's liberation movement in Massachusetts. She was a teacher at Salem State, where she pioneered work regarding the union in the school, the women liberation movement, and also pay equity and marriage equality in Massachusetts.
Great. Thank you so much, Maria. Charity, I'll ask you the same question.
Sure. So I spoke with two of the women that I spoke with rather, Dr. Jace Broussard, and ultimately, unfortunately, we weren't able to get a full interview recorded. We're hoping to get that maybe at a later time. But she is a current professor of mass communications at Louisiana State University. which is my alma mater. She was also the first African-American to graduate from LSU with a degree in journalism. She has worked for several executive offices, working as their press secretaries, doing all of their communications. She's also ranked as the #1 mass communication professor in the country currently, and done a lot of great work. She grew up herself in southern Louisiana on a plantation with parents who did not finish high school, and just kind of speaks a lot about how that experience impacted her, one, just as a student and as a woman, and kind of how she was able to dream outside of her present circumstances. The second woman who I think is really a fireball is my grandmother, who Professor Scholes met. And she grew up in the 50s and 60s in Starkville, Mississippi. Got married the year she graduated from high school and moved to Germany with my grandfather, ultimately working as a nurse in the army. And also, which is something that I did not know, she worked with my grandfather and they were the presidents of their local NAACP chapter. So a lot of fun history there.
Great, thanks, Charity. Kira, who have you saw interviews from?
Judge Angela Mazzarelli. She was the longest serving female justice on the appellate court in New York. She was raised in Massachusetts, went to Brandeis University in the 60s and got a full ride to Columbia Law School in the late 60s, early 70s. Was one of the few women there. In her interview process while she was seeking lawyer jobs, faced a lot of discrimination when she showed up to the interview and they saw that she was a woman. Basically, they would turn her away. But she eventually got a job in Bronx Legal Services. She also got elected to be a judge. First, she ran her own firm for a little bit. And then, yeah, she had a very long tenure as a judge. The second interview I did was Dr. Marie Moore. She was bused to an integrated school in St. Louis in the late 50s. She faced a lot of discrimination at school, and she ended up getting her doctorate in education, became a social worker, moved to California, really loved her life there. And then Shirley King was my last interview. She was an underwriter for MetLife Insurance and just kind of moved up the corporate ladder starting in the 70s. And yeah, she's really, really inspirational.
Great, thanks. And Bailey, who did you interview?
Yeah, so my first interview was with my grandmother, who grew up in the 40s and 50s, went to college in late 50s, early 60s, for the first time, basically just get married. And then I actually went back to school after she had children, so she was really interesting to talk to and get to know a lot better about how she grew up and her thought process for how she was navigating life. My second one was Diane Speakman. She was a family friend who also grew up around the same time as my grandmother. She was a speech therapist, so she talked about a lot of different types of things that she saw in school and getting her education that were really interesting to know about. And my final one was with Sammy Ellis. She was the first female referee to referee professional soccer, which was really interesting to see because she talked about how soccer wasn't even really on the table for her and stuff like that growing up. So that was a really interesting interview as well.
Great, thanks. Professor Scholes, I know you don't do the interviews. Are there any you want to call out that kind of stick out in your mind? And if not, that's okay. We can move on.
I will tell you.
I will tell you that one of my favorite interviews of all time is actually your grandmother's interview. This woman, just amazing. And when you listen to her story and she talks about realizing that she can do whatever she wants to do, it was like a light bulb went off in her mind. It was right before her divorce. It was like a light bulb went off in her mind. She saw all of these women in the feminist movement, and she saw women doing things, and she was like, wait. And I believe her quote on our website is something like, I can be one of those women. And I can do this too. And that's when she went back to school. So anyway, it's one of my favorite interviews.
Amazing. Well, thank you all for talking about who you've interviewed. I'll open the floor now. We don't have to go down the line. But what are some of the most surprising or shocking things that you learned during any of your interviews?
I would say some of the most shocking things is when you think back to think about like why we needed feminism and you think like, oh, they didn't allow women to do this. They didn't allow them to be here. When they would talk about a lot of their stories, it wasn't even like anyone was actively telling them no. It was just like they weren't even considered. Like when I would talk to Sammy Ellis, she would say that it wasn't like anyone was really protesting against her being a referee, but they didn't have women's locker rooms, they didn't have anywhere for her to get changed, so it was almost more of like an administrative thing. So it was like, really interesting to hear that it wasn't as maybe staunch they were getting paid or anything like that for it, but it was like they weren't just even considered as an option. And that's why they weren't going forward with doing a lot of these things, so the first people had to kind of be uncomfortable, and she told me she would have to change in the guest, in like the bathroom where the fans would change. So they didn't have a referee uniform and come out and people would be like, oh, that's the referee for the game. You know, so I thought that was kind of interesting.
Yeah. Charity, you mentioned being surprised by just some of what you learned about your grandmother. Was there anything in particular that really stuck out to you as shocking?
Yeah, I think, for me, my grandma has a very interesting way of like talking about her life, because a lot of times she'll say things in passing that like, when you think about them after the fact, you're like, wait, that really happened. So like, one thing that she talked about a lot was kind of the intersection of being both a woman and being African American, and kind of how that really played into her experience, because she would say like, on certain fronts, one thing that she mentioned was the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and kind of talking about how she saw some of the immediate changes that came with that legislation as far as women in the workplace even, and that sort of thing. But she was like, even when we started to get past some of those kind of gender-based barriers, we're just also still dealing with like race and other kind of parts of your identity that are kind of intersectional in that sense. So just her kind of like unpacking the different layers of, I guess, things that she went through and that other women who were similarly situated went through when they were kind of trying to navigate their social and professional lives and things like that.
Absolutely. Kiera or Maria, do you want to add?
Yeah, similarly, one of my witnesses, Shirley Haney, talked a lot about that as well, the intersection of race and gender, and her mom, growing up, her mom always told her that you have to be twice as good to be considered equal, and that line really stuck with me. Yeah, so many experiences that my witnesses talked about were so eye-opening. Judge Mazzarelli, just, I think it really hit home because she was also a law student, and just how like different her experience was. Like for instance, for the bar exam, like women were separated in a different room. Things, or just, yeah, just things like that, little things. Also, when she was awarded her scholarship for Columbia Law at the dinner where she was kind of like given this, speaking with her, like her sponsors, they thought that she was a man because they thought it was Angelo Mazzarelli instead of Angela Mazzarelli, and they asked where her husband was. Yeah, like wasn't even considered that it would be a woman, accepting a scholarship. And something that cropped up a lot in the interviews was that, that women didn't really drive. I think that was something that was surprising that we saw in a couple different interviews. Yeah, just little things that really, well, they're big things, but that I didn't really know about before.
And something that stuck out to me is just sometimes they just reply, well, that's how it was. And you see them like reflecting on their life that maybe that was not right. Maybe things could have been different if they had perspective at the time. But you see them in that moment saying, yeah, that was strange. And now considering their daughters, their granddaughters, so and what life they have now. So I think that was interesting.
Well, it's clear that what you've learned during these interviews was sometimes surprising, sometimes unexpected. So what did the things that you did learn during those interviews, how does that shape your view of events going on today?
I think one thing for me, like my grandma, just towards the end of the interview, talked a lot about legacy and how she sees like my mother and myself as an extension of that. And a lot of the work that she did and kind of the barriers that she faced in her personal and professional life being things that we've surpassed by this point, and that being a huge thing for her. Another thing that she, like I said to me, is like there's nothing new under the sun. So a lot of the same issues and things that we're facing have been here and have shown up in different forms. And she's saying like, we've always pushed past, we've always progressed. So you kind of have to have that faith that things can and will get better. So.
Yeah, I definitely agree that, it's, you know, we have to carry on the legacy and it's a privilege to be where we are and like, just kind of, very eye-opening how much women had to fight for what we have now and that, you know, we have to carry on their work. And yeah, it was really great to see that the women that we spoke with had a lot of hope, but also they really fought for a lot. And yeah, so we have to keep fighting for that.
Yeah, just remember that it wasn't that long ago that they were treated this way, and if you don't hear these stories and learn about them, you're bound to take for granted what you had, and you know, like history repeats itself if you don't learn from it. So I think it was really important to hear that. So for how to think about the world today and know to fight for these things and those more things that were always guaranteed to them.
Well, and just to follow up on what you all have said, so two of the women we interviewed over the course of the past few years, one of them is a former state senator from New Jersey, Loretta Weinberg, and another one is a former United States senator, I believe from Maryland, right? Barbara Mikulski, Maryland? Pretty sure it's Maryland. Anyways, so what's interesting is both of them in their early careers fought for things like equal pay, fought for things like childcare. We're still fighting for that today, right? We're still fighting for equal pay today. They fought for better healthcare. They fought for the early education things that are now being stripped away. So just to hear the things that they were fighting for so many decades ago, and we're still working on them today. Barbara Mikulski was one of the first women. She, along with, oh goodness, senator from Illinois, it's escaping me right now. But anyways, they were the first women to wear pants on the Senate floor. And that was in 1993. Yeah, sit with that for a minute.
Yep, and particularly my interview with Pat, she's 88 or 85. She's currently in Hawaii. She's still doing activism right now. She's protesting something for the environment. So it's important that sometimes they're still working on it in their way. Some more active than others, but the fight that they've done throughout their life, either big or small, whatever it is, they're still working on it. And I think it's up to us to take the reins and keep fighting.
Absolutely. Picking up where the discussion kind of led off with the fact that these women enacted legislation that is now potentially at risk. What do you think these women would say has had the biggest impact on them? And what do you think they would say of these laws will be the most consequential moving forward?
Well, Pat was very outspoken. She's really worried about the state of things. As I told you, she pioneered the equal pay in Salem State, marriage equality. She has been working all throughout her life to achieve not only a better life for herself, she always wanted this sense of freedom that she believed that she had to give herself that freedom. So she's not worried about herself. She's towards the end of her life, but she's pretty worried about everything. It's my answer, but young people, about how she's gonna leave when her time comes.
That when I interviewed my grandmother, she had a lot to say about what she did before Roe v. Wade and how she would help women find healthcare and things like that. And I feel like with today, she says a lot about how that was a lot of risk she put on herself to try and help other people. And that sometimes, you know, even if you see people in need and even if other people are regulating against it, you should try and do something about it.
I think one thing that my grandma had continued to say to me, even like when I first told her that I'd be starting law school and everything, was just to keep fighting and to keep showing up in these spaces and having a voice. One quote that she always reminds me of is, I believe it was HerStory, which says that if you're silent about your pain, it will kill you and say that you enjoyed it. And so one thing that she's always told me is that like, even if you are in situations and dealing with things that don't look like they're being better, never be quiet about it, continue to be outspoken and fierce to let people know what's going on and to draw attention to the things that require that kind of that help and that patience and that support from other people because you can't do it all yourself.
Well, certainly all of these laws, we talked to at least one woman who each of these laws would have had a major impact. One of the laws that I remember hearing over and over and over was the Pregnancy Discrimination Act. We interviewed many women from many different types of professions. We, let's see, in the medical profession, in education, in finance and banking, all of whom we interviewed a stewardess, all of whom lost their jobs because they got pregnant. There was no such thing as maternity leave. There was no such thing as the FMLA. So for some of these women, the minute they were pregnant and their bosses found out, they had to quit. For some of them, they were allowed to work until they showed, until you could tell they were pregnant, and then they had to quit. Some of them were allowed to work until their 7th month, but they would be put in a back office where no one could see them. And then they were, then they had to quit when they had their child. But there was no guarantee that they would get their job back after they had the child. So they just basically lost their jobs. And so I think if you were to ask many of the women that we interviewed, I think they would probably say the PDA would have had the biggest effect on their lives.
Would anyone else like to chime in before I move on to the next question?
Yeah, just say that my witnesses definitely talked about like losing their jobs when they got pregnant. And yeah, that was the one that impacted their lives.
So it's clear these women faced a lot of challenges. They had to deal with a lot of bull crap, I'll say. So I'll turn the tables to you guys. Do you all think you would be here, that you would be in law school if you grew up at the same time as these women? I stumped them, it looks like.
Well, I'm not from the US, so the circumstances are a little bit different. But I had a similar case. Well, my grandmother was initially going to study in law school. She was very fortunate. Her parents were very open. But she got married and she quit. She left school after her 2nd year. And I think that was something very common. It was a class about 100 people, only 10 women. And she got married and about 4 finished actually from her class. So if I was, it's not the same per se, but if I put myself back in my country, I would think I would have ended up somewhere along the lines of my grandmother. So maybe I would have tried, but circumstances would have come on the way. I would like to believe that I would have graduated and become one of the first lawyers of my country, but being realistic, I think the social circumstances pushed these women in different routes.
Yeah, my grandmother, she went to Longwood University and she basically said to get her MRS degree. So she was going to go for 2 years, find her husband, and then leave. And she ended up going back, as Professor Schultz said, after she saw like really the wave of feminism and all this kind of stuff. So I guess I could see myself following that path as well. Because I feel like I'm not always the fire starter, but I'm someone that can like really feel when people are passionate about things and, you know, have my eyes open to maybe, oh, I could do this or I could do that. So I think if I was alive back then, that would be a similar route to how I would go.
Yeah, I don't know, something that really stuck out to me, with, Judge Mazzarelli's interview, like, when she was first denied, or she kept getting denied her first lawyer job because they just saw that she was a woman, and she went back to, on maybe the fourth try where this happened, she, like, basically went into the boss's office and said, I'm not putting up with this anymore, this is a crazy, like, basically called him out for that. And then she got the job. So I don't know if I would have that sort of courage to do that. I think it really took a lot of courage back then to be able to do something like that. So I would like to think that I would, but.
Yeah, I think I feel really similarly. I would like to think that I would have still ended up in law school, but like realistically speaking, like my grandmother's experience and even my mom's experience were very different from mine. And like when I started law school, I was the first person in my family to pursue a graduate degree, anything beyond a bachelor's degree. And it's been extremely difficult for me, so I can only imagine, given like all the legislation that has passed and kind of the way society has progressed in regards to its views on women and education and that sort of thing, that I have the benefit of their experiences. But like, even like I said, just looking back and hearing their stories, I'm not sure that I would still be here.
Now, flipping it a little bit, do you all think you would be here today if not for these fire starters, as Bailey called them, these women who were in Congress and getting these laws passed? Do you think without these women, you would be on this stage today?
I feel like even when I think about with my family generationally, I picture myself and my family, like we work hard so that like the next generation can have it easier. Like I'm a first generation lawyer and like maybe one day my kid will have a way easier time getting to go to law school than I did. So when I think of these women who really were the catalyst to getting to me to where I am today, I don't think we would be here without them because they had to kick open the door so that we could walk through it, you know?
Professor Scholes, you want to add something?
I can tell you I would not be on this stage today if the laws were still the way they were back then. If the laws were pre-Roe v. Wade, there's no way I would be sitting here because I got pregnant at 19. And had I had that baby, there's no way I would have had to drop out of undergrad. I was not independently wealthy. My parents were not wealthy people. So yeah, I would never have finished my undergraduate degree, let alone gone for any kind of, additional degree. I don't even know what I would have done. I mean, maybe I would have eventually, I don't know. But thanks to Roe v. Wade, thanks to living in Illinois at the time, and thanks to having really, really remarkable healthcare and the ability to have the healthcare, I was able to complete my degree and have the life that I wanted. I had economic independence.
Yeah. And in light of that, I don't know if it'll come up today, but I do know we've interviewed women who served as Janes. So for those of you who don't know, pre-Roe v. Wade, you could call Jane if you needed assistance with women's reproductive health. And so those are some interviews that we have up on our website as well. I definitely recommend checking those out. Getting back into it, what was one of the most difficult parts of interviewing these women?
I would say crafting questions that didn't come off, like you were judging them, because of course you want to say like, oh, so you have to stay at home? Like, no, this is their life and we're not here to, judge it. But even though we want to bring out those specific facts that show, the comparison to how life was then compared to now, that's still their life and they might have been happy, living it. So crafting the questions in a way that really spoke to their story and not just trying to like get a point across, is pretty difficult.
Yeah, I would say kind of following up on that, like not coming across as judgmental, but also not framing their stories in a way that made it appear as though it was just super traumatic. Because a lot of the things that were very commonplace when they were growing up are things that like are kind of very distinct from anything we would expect in today's climate. But like you said, like that was just kind of the time that they came up in. And for a lot of them, they were able to kind of overcome a lot of those barriers and kind of go on to do amazing things. So not necessarily speaking from a place of trauma, but just more or less like, it's amazing that you're standing where you are today, given the circumstances and the way that things were kind of set up at that time. So kind of be more, I guess, optimistic about kind of framing their experiences in that way.
And like, creating like a narrative, when you're like preparing for the interview, and just making sure you're doing like your fact gathering and your research, so that you can like sort of frame their personal experiences within the cultural backdrop and ask about like the legislation and things like that, to kind of paint the full picture. I thought that was challenging in a good way.
Yeah, for me, it was trying to make gendered focused questions without the interview feeling gendered focused. Like, we want to make these points, we want to talk about this legislation, but we don't want to be like right up to her, like, was your boss a man? No. So it was a little bit tough, but I think with work, it went well.
Also, along the lines of what Bailey was saying, one of the things we work really hard on, and especially during our constructive critique, is how as we're interviewing women, how we respond to the stories that we hear, because we don't always know their stories. And so I forget which woman we were interviewing this semester, but she told a story about she's in a car and she looks next to her and she sees a woman who is super straight driving, and nobody drives like that. And so she was really taken aback. And so she was looking and trying to figure out what's going on. Turns out the woman was being kidnapped and she had a knife to her throat. And that's why she was sitting so erectly. Well, of course, this was before cell phones. And so she was with a friend, they drove to the nearest gas station, called the police. And guess what? The police did nothing, because it was, I think there was an issue of what land they were on and whether it was tribal land or federal land. And they didn't even bother to let the tribal land authorities know. They just said, it's not our problem. We don't care. And so the woman has no idea what happened to that woman who had a knife to her throat. So responding to this story, as you're sitting here and you're listening to this story, trying not to judge, trying not to say things that would, create more trauma, is really important. And we work really hard on that.
That's actually a great segue into my next question. So I know you're going into these interviews prepared. I know you have questions ahead of time, but how often do you go off script when you get a story like this? And more importantly, how do you respond when you get a difficult kind of story or situation that you need to respond to?
We went off script a lot, but that was probably also one of the most challenging things, is to make those snap judgments about whether to follow down that line of questioning or to just stay on script. Just deciding whether it was relevant or not. But I felt like more often than not, I would ask follow-up questions, and try not to miss any opportunities to paint more of the picture of what they were talking about. But yeah, it was hard, especially for the more difficult moments. So yeah, that was something you really had to think on your feet the whole time. But I felt like that was also good for, like, that is something that a lawyer has to do. So I felt like that was also good practice.
Yeah, I agree. I think some of it was reading, even though it's over Zoom, kind of like reading facial expressions and body language. Because sometimes I think even when I take all this time to do these questions, especially in the first interview, and then I realized I'm assuming a lot of things. Like, oh, she played field hockey. Did I ask why? Maybe it's because they didn't have a soccer team for girls, like maybe they only offered field hockey and volleyball. So when I was asking these questions, sometimes, it could get derailed because I realized I was making an assumption that I have to ask that follow-up and go into it, and sometimes it could lead to a type of difficult story that you don't even realize you could ask go. For example, like with field hockey or soccer, and maybe they're really upset that they didn't get to play that, and when they come back with a heartfelt story or some type of emotion, it can be hard to navigate because you want to remain professional and that this is an interview, but you also don't want to make them feel unheard. So that was
I think I made the choice with my final two interviews to go for it when they started going off in a story. Normally it ends up being pretty interesting. But just make sure to go back to the outline, to what I want to go to. But normally when they start talking about a story, something that they kind of want to tell you, they had it in the back of their mind, and they really want to tell it. So I found those moments actually quite interesting, and some of the best moments in the interviews, just because it's very natural, it's very flowing, it's something that they really want to tell, and it's pretty interesting.
Anyone else want to jump in before we move ahead? Okay. So I'm going to direct this question. Actually, any of you can answer it, but I know Charity and Bailey, you both mentioned interviewing your grandmothers. Is it more or less difficult to interview somebody you know well than to interview a stranger, somebody you've only emailed back and forth a few times?
I would definitely say it was a lot more difficult planning for my grandmother's interview because it's kind of like, I felt like I was going in kind of knowing a lot about her life. Realistically, there was a lot that I did not know, but also there's kind of like this assumed level of familiarity where it's kind of like, of course you already know this, so I don't need to go into this level of detail, but still wanting to make sure that you're conveying kind of the full story and painting a full picture for whoever's going to watch it kind of down the line, to really understand kind of the intricacies and like the nuances of why they made the decisions that they did, and kind of even to understand why they're telling the story in the way that they are. So I think it was more difficult to kind of draw out some of those pieces because it's like, well, obviously, you know, this person is, this is your brother, this is your aunt, your uncle. It's like, I know this, but like other people might be missing kind of some of those pieces if we don't draw that out. So
yeah, I agree. It was kind of tough to pretend at times that I didn't know things that I already knew about her. It was kind of difficult to plan because I only knew what she's told me. So sometimes I wasn't even thinking to ask a certain type of question because I was like, oh, I don't think my grandma does that. But then at the same time, once I started the interview, it almost felt easier than like halfway through some of my other interviews because I feel like the rapport is better. Because, you know, someone you know, and like, it just felt like I was talking to my grandma at some point. It was honestly a really rewarding experience. And I feel like even during the interview, I was like gaining like trust with her, and it was just like a really great experience.
Yeah. Did either of you have a more personal interview? If not, that's perfectly fine. We can move on.
I tried to interview both my grandmas, like I asked both of them, but they both said no. Just because their memory's kind of going, so it's for the best, but I wanted to.
Yeah.
I didn't interview my mom, but one of my students interviewed my mom, and watching that interview to grade it was really fun because I learned so much about my mom. I had no idea, which I mean, I am considerably older than all of you. So I thought I knew a lot about my mom, and she had some interesting stories to tell.
Absolutely. Now, of course, we do this project to learn about these women, to learn about what it was like living when these laws didn't exist or as they were first coming into existence. But I'm curious, for the four students up here, did you develop any skills through interviewing these witnesses that you've carried forward into other areas of your life?
I think the point about phrasing questions well was important, that I really was able to hone that skill. That I think, well, Professor Schultz talked about how important it is in trial practice for like direct examinations and cross-examinations. And now I'm in like a criminal procedure class where we're doing that, and I noticed that work that I did in the clinic really helped me for that, like, cross-examination exercise and like the leading questions and making sure that you're kind of making sure that the answer that is elicited is like the answer that is a clear answer that you want.
Yeah, definitely. Coming up with the questions was a lot more work than I thought it was going to be. And I feel like in litigation, if you're doing a deposition or something, making sure that you're asking the right questions is just as important as, well, the most important, because that's gonna list the answers you're gonna get. And then not only that, but I feel like we became masters in like the redirect, where our witnesses would go on long tangents and you kind of have to like pinpoint one thing they said and kind of like go, oh, but I noticed you said this. Can we go back to this point? So I thought that was a pretty good skill to learn.
Yeah, I definitely think like, kind of reiterating what you said about listening and making sure that you're actually kind of catching the words that the person is saying to you. Even like in questions where you kind of feel like you already kind of know what the answer is and you're just kind of moving the conversation forward. A lot of times, like they would say things that was like, oh, wait a minute, let me take a second to really kind of flesh that out and see why they're using the words that they're using or why they're describing this in a certain way, because a lot of times, like, that was kind of where the really interesting topics were, and kind of like the mundane details that they just kind of said in passing, when you really explored that there was a lot there.
Professor Scholes, you wanted to add something?
I was going to say, I know you all learned listening skills because you knew how to follow up. You were listening to the answers that you were getting, not just thinking about the next question. If you're always thinking about the next question, and by the way, you probably all have this issue in just regular conversation. Instead of listening to what somebody is saying to you, you're thinking about what you want to say, and you're missing the context, and you're missing what's going on in front of you. And that's one of the most important skills, I think, of as being a lawyer, is listening, really, really listening. And I know you all have done that because I watched your interviews.
I will say, as somebody who took litigation skills with Professor Scholes this semester, she was quick to remind me that what I learned in the lab was going to be helpful for this class too. So it definitely carries over. Now, I'm going to do something that we are never supposed to do in your interviews for this class or any interview. And I'm going to say I have one final question for you all. We've talked a lot about difficulties with these interviews, the challenges these women faced, but I want to end on a positive note. So I'm going to ask you all, what's something that you were inspired by in conducting these interviews? There's just so many options. They can't choose one.
While you are all thinking, I have obviously watched every single interview because I get to grade them all. And I will tell you, for me, watching them, for me, it's hope. I heard that over and over and over again. The hope, the resilience, the inability to quit. And it was really inspiring.
Even a lot of their ability to be happy for me, like the life that I live today, like especially if we're talking with my grandmother, everything that she says, that she worked hard, and all these women that created things that I could live the life that I have today. There's no like sense of like bitterness or like, oh, I didn't get to do that, I didn't get to do this. It all just was so happy, like they were so happy that this is where we're getting to and that things have evolved past there.
Yeah, my witnesses all seem very like happy and proud of like their own lives and like the choices that they made, and you could just tell that they were like just really proud of all that they accomplished, and I think the interviews helped them like reflect upon that, but it was really like heartwarming and inspiring that they accomplished so much and faced a lot of adversity, but looking back, they were all really happy and proud of themselves.
Yeah, I think definitely how strategic and innovative a lot of them were. Like, honestly, to the extent where I think like sometimes they didn't even realize it until they were like telling their story. And like, they were just like, well, we couldn't do this, so obviously we had to find another way to get around that. So we like found a way to kind of shortcut like this legislative thing that was kind of keeping us from doing what we wanted to do. And we found a workaround, and we found another way to receive an education. We found another way to have a career while still having children. and all these other things. So just kind of how strategic and innovative they were at a time where a lot of things in society were working against them.
I guess for me, while talking to two of my witnesses, they said, well, I don't have a very interesting life, pretty normal life, completely ordinary. And I was like, no, but everybody has a story to tell. And somewhere along the interview, I think they also realized that, well, yeah, I have accomplished a lot. And that was very nice to see. And what you guys were saying, that they feel pride on their life and what they achieved. And also that they're really happy to be able to get to tell their stories, and just like recollect these oral histories that they can show their families. And I think there's a real sense of joy when they realize, oh yeah, that I did that. So I think that's pretty cool.
Well, thank you all so much for coming up and speaking today, for sharing your experience. Thank you all for being here. Thank you to everyone on Zoom.